Thank you all for making the long trip. I'm sure all of us are from different places across South Africa. I hope those who arrived yesterday, you slept well. So we are good to go. We will not wait for any more people. My name is Stephen Munyao. I'm the summit director. I will be helping you, assisting you with the summit today and tomorrow. I'm a director at Africa Insights. And we've been running the Affordable Student Housing Summits for the last 4 years now. This is the third one. The first one we did with a couple of other partners, and then we went separate. Then we started the annual Affordable Student Housing in the last 3 years. So this is the third one. It's a series that we are doing also in Africa. We've also done that in Kenya, and we are also going to do this in Nigeria. The student housing crisis cuts across almost all the African countries. I don't know whether it's an issue of planning or it's something that was overlooked, but all the countries are facing almost similar challenges when it comes to very increased student populations and very few available, especially purpose-built student accommodation. So when we started this summit, our main goal was we looked at the South African scenario, which was also escalating to the school fees issues, and the school fees must fall. So we started looking at the challenge, and then we decided to bring in all the key stakeholders in the space to look at solutions that will accelerate provision of student housing. I'm sure we got in the audience online, we got delegations from DHET and others. We know that the issue that has been there in South Africa. We're looking at about 500,000 beds shortage. That is for the universities and TVETs. We know what is happening with the private developers, and also on the government side, and the DFIs, the likes of DBSA and others. So there are efforts to try to close the gap, the supply gap, but the demand obviously outweighs supply. So in this summit, with our huge participation online especially, we are looking at solutions. So we open the summit to all the participants online and those who are here to kind of interact, share ideas, share insights. Let's look at solutions that will help provide student housing. Student housing has been closely related to performance of students at institutions of higher learning. And we feel, even from an impact perspective, if students get proper, accessible, sustainable, and safe student housing, it will have an impact on their performances and future opportunities when it comes to their future careers and opportunities. So this summit, in essence, will try to come up with solutions. And we thank all our partners who have come on board to assist us in this process. Our lead partners, DBSA, Goodson Capital Partners, and all the universities that have put in resources and send in delegates and speakers to try to assist us in this process. So it's a completely very integrated and mixed up kind of audience and speakers who have different kind of experiences in the student housing space. And we also look at how these solutions can be found also in the built environment. Looking at technologies in the built space, looking at any solution that will accelerate provision of student housing. So without further ado, I will invite our lead partner, DBSA, to do a welcome address. So I will invite Palesa Ryan from DBSA. She will give us a welcome address. Welcome, Palesa.
Good morning and welcome to the 3rd Annual Affordable Student Housing Summit. A big welcome also to our other delegates who are participating digitally. Thank you all for taking the time to attend the summit, which seeks to deliberate on and ignite our thought processes around the challenge facing our youth, the chronic shortage of student housing, which our summit director, Mr. Munyao, has already mentioned. My name is Palesa Ryan and I represent the platinum sponsor, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, commonly known as the DBSA. My role at the DBSA is the head of social infrastructure, which is comprised of social housing, health, which is the funding of projects in the health sector, clinics, hospitals, health technology, and education. This includes funding projects at a primary, secondary, and tertiary level, as well as student housing, which is why I'm standing before you today. I'll briefly highlight who the platinum sponsor DBSA is. DBSA is one of the continent's leading development finance institutions. We look at a number of sectors which comprise social infrastructure, which I've already mentioned. Also within this space is water and sanitation. We look at economic infrastructure, which is energy and environment, ICT, transport and logistics. We also have a strong presence in the metros and cities portfolio within Southern Africa. Geographically, we have a large footprint which spans both this country as well as sub-Saharan Africa. The United Nations projects that the world population will hit 10 billion people by 2055. Approximately 95% of this growth will take place in lower and middle income countries. Of this growth, Africa will account for 57%, translating to 1.4 billion people. In particular, the population of sub-Saharan Africa is expected to double by 2050. Almost 60% of our continent's population is under the age of 25, making us the youngest population, the youngest continent by demographic. Against this backdrop, it's evident that education on a continent like ours is critical in, amongst others, reducing income inequality, promoting social mobility through greater access to skills, training, and jobs, and ultimately reducing stubborn unemployment and increasing economic gains. One of the challenges the SA's formal tertiary education system is facing is the shortage of high quality and affordable student housing units. That we are here is a telling sign that we don't need to be convinced of this. Depending on the literature that you're reading or the person that you're speaking to, this figure ranges from 300 to 500,000 beds. It's safe to say that it's stark and staggering, and is projected to increase. Further, with the availability of NSFAS funding, tertiary institutions are seeing unprecedented number of student intake, which is going to exacerbate this bed shortage. It isn't all doom and gloom though. Our government has illustrated commendable commitment to increasing student housing in a number of ways. As a start, they've provided a clear regulatory framework for the construction of student housing, namely the policy on the norms and standards for student housing. As funders, we place great reliance on these in assessing the technical adequacy and minimum quality standard of student housing projects which are presented to us. Secondly, funding support for lower income students through programs like NSFAS, which are integral to improving access to higher education. For less affluent universities, we are seeing off-campus developers peg these figures in their financial models against the accommodation allocation in the NSFAS allowance to make the housing both competitive and affordable. Another great initiative that the government has launched in partnership with National Treasury and the DBSA is the Social Housing Infrastructure Program Management Office. I suggest we call it SHIPMO. It just rolls off the tongue easier that way. SHIPMO is intended to facilitate the development and funding of student housing while creating an enabling environment for investments. DBSA prides itself on this partnership. The first phase is set to deliver 14,000 beds across 6 university campuses. Of these, we've already funded 5. We are currently in the feasibility study phase for the second phase, which will target 6 university campuses and 6 TVET campuses, and will produce 24,000 beds. Construction is expected in 2022. Not to be outdone, the private sector also wants in, and rightfully so. The yields in this asset class are very attractive, ranging between 10 and 14%. The average that we've seen sits at about 11%. The shortage of beds is such that there is sufficient need for the private sector to also get involved, particularly in light of the massive funding gap. My business unit is seeing a number of interesting off-campus private sector offerings. There are combinations of pure privately held developments where there's an OpCo-PropCo structure. We are also seeing some triple P deals where the developers build, own, and transfer the property to the university after 20 years and after having earned the returns. And a new one that's coming up is where the university enterprise holding companies are being offered equity stakes in return for head leases or strong undertakings to get student numbers into the housing units. The chafe for both developers, operators, and funders alike remains the market risk we are exposed to in the absence of head leases. This has consequences for the developers, which include higher equity injection requirement by funders like ourselves, shorter loan tenures, cumbersome security packages, as well as higher pricing for the perceived risk. In the pursuit of high yields, the norms and standards are also seen as restrictive for the developers, particularly as they're being pushed to reduce the cost of development while maintaining the higher cost of development cost. It bears mentioning that the student housing shortage is prevalent in other African countries too. I was in Accra 6 weeks ago where there's an aggressive rollout of CODBIT colleges. Most of these sites are in remote areas and will accordingly require student housing. Similar trends are being seen in Kenya as well as in Sierra Leone. When I look across this room, and I wish I could look across digitally as well, I am pleased to note the mix of policymakers, institutions, funders, investors, and students alike. The truth is that this challenge is too complex for one class of stakeholder to solve. It truly requires a concerted effort. A number of creative approaches will also need to be adopted, as opposed to a cookie-cutter approach. The summit has an exciting 2 days of interactive presentations and panel discussions, which I am greatly looking forward to. There are a number of breaks, and I encourage you all to utilize them to have the very necessary and important side conversations about our shared interest. In parting, thank you for allowing the DBSA to partner in this summit, which is of national importance and is of great importance to us as well. Thank you.
Okay, good morning everyone, and also a big welcome to everyone that's tuned in virtually. I want to thank you, Stephen, for putting together this opportunity for us to come together to discuss this very important topic. And also, it's the first conference I've attended in person since this whole pandemic has started, so it's an incredibly exciting moment to actually be in a room with other people and not just tuning into a Zoom meeting or a Zoom conference. So Stephen asked me to do the keynote this morning, and I'm largely going to touch on what Palesa has already mentioned, and I'm going to contextualize it within the context of Johannesburg. Over the past 4 years, I've conducted research on studentification in Johannesburg, which looks at the broad impacts associated with student accommodation, or rather private student accommodation within a city, and how it contributes to aspects of neighborhood change but also urban change. So first off, just as a broad introduction, universities are incredibly important institutions, or let me rather reframe it as higher education institutions. I shouldn't be prioritizing just universities, but higher education institutions are incredibly important institutions in a local economy. Universities are also incredibly resilient institutions. They are unlikely to move, they are unlikely to stop operating or contract in size during times of economic recession or downturn. So they're fairly stable in their presence. Importantly, universities are also producers of human capital, and we all know that this is incredibly important, especially for South Africa that's trying to pursue a knowledge-based economy. Universities also fuel innovation, and it has important linkages with industry, research, and government. But I think very importantly, and that is for everyone in this room, especially on the investor angle of things, the purchasing power of university staff, and more particularly in this case students, is quite sizable. And this has produced a distinctive housing market with specific consumption requirements. So what is studentification? Some of you might have heard this topic before. For some of you it might be a new concept. But it is essentially linked to the in-migration of students into cities, settling in private accommodation near universities, usually off campus. And there are various impacts associated with this. Various economic, social, cultural, and physical impacts are associated with this process. Since the 1980s globally, and more since the late 1990s in South Africa, we've seen the massification of higher education. This is partly linked with the neoliberalization of higher education globally, and also universities becoming more entrepreneurial. So universities have shifted in supplying accommodation, but are rather looking outwards or outsourcing functions such as student accommodation. So this whole shift in focus has really seen the growth of the private student accommodation market, especially in mature markets such as the UK. And we are only really seeing that taking off now in the context of the Global South, and particularly in South Africa. So the geographies of students, or the patterns of students, where they settle, where they're located, have shifted and changed over time. So the term studentification was first coined by Darren Smith in 2002, and he defines it as the process of social, cultural, economic, and physical changes that occur resulting from the influx of students, usually within privately rented accommodation. So throughout the 2000s, it's become a buzzword in media, in policy, especially in the United Kingdom, but it has traveled elsewhere, and a lot of research has been conducted on this topic in the global north, but also increasingly in the global south. So conceptually, there's a strong link between studentification and gentrification. Similar processes can be examined or witnessed in studentification. So if we look at some of the economic links or conceptual links with gentrification, studentification also sees the revalorization and inflation of property prices. And this is particularly in areas within close proximity to higher education institutions. Property owners, investors, and developers identify a rent gap. There's a realization that a lot more rent can be achieved or received from a particular property if it is rented out to students. Socially, we can see the replacement and displacement of long-term residents to make way for the student market. I think we've witnessed this in areas such as Auckland Park and Hatfield, just to think of a few examples. And it creates new patterns of social concentration of students, but also forms of segregation in our cities. Culturally, we all know students have a very distinctive lifestyle, and this can often be in conflict with long-term residents. And physically, contradictory to gentrification, however, there might be an initial upgrade of urban space or physical space, but over long term and depending on the local context, we can also see a downgrading of urban space. And this is particularly more the case with student communes, which can sometimes lead to the aesthetic decline of certain residential areas. So within the international literature, there are two broad types of student housing. These are housing in multiple occupation, as well as purpose-built student accommodation. So my research focused on both these markets in Johannesburg. And quite often, housing in multiple occupation is seen as first wave studentification. And then later on, as the market matures, you see the shift to more property development and purpose-built student accommodation. So, housing and multiple occupation in South Africa would be your student communes or shared housing options for students. And obviously we've seen a lot of purpose-built development, student accommodation, as well as retrofitted student accommodation in the past 10, 15 years in South Africa. So, investors are attracted to housing and multiple occupation, but as well as purpose-built student accommodation for various reasons. And they are actively helping to shape the environment that students are living in. So investors, property developers, and institutional actors are actively shaping the student geographies. Student areas are manufactured by both public and private sector institutions. Students are often consumers of ready-made spaces. Student lifestyle is being commodified, packaged, and sold. So I think important here is the focus on student lifestyle. It's not just offering student accommodation, but it is offering a complete lifestyle. And this has linkages with places to recreate, places to party and socialize, to go shopping. So student lifestyle has become a lucrative sector for corporate investors, and it is seen as a stable and niche market for rental income. I quite like this quote from Chatterton, and he summarizes the process as whole swaths of city centers become dedicated to servicing students, especially in terms of retail, entertainment, and leisure. Pubs, bars, nightclubs, and fast foods and other retail outlets all pitch themselves at this lucrative, sizable, and dependable consumer population. And Braamfontein really comes to mind when I read this quote, as well as Hatfield. So the role that students play is also not passive. Quite often students are depicted as passive consumers of these ready-made urban spaces. But students actively seek neighborhoods that fit with their student lifestyle. They actively look for places that fit with their collective consumption habits. They have decision making, and often their decision making is motivated according to affordability, safety, proximity, but also personality and taste. So I'm not going to go too much into detail with these slides, but the impact of studentification is incredibly diverse, and I will talk about the impact a little bit more when I shift to some of my primary data. Economically, we see it disrupts or it changes the supply and demand for housing close to universities or higher education institutions. It also affects the supply and demand for affordable housing, and I think part of the focus of this conference is affordability, and quite often we see an inflation of property prices and rental rates the closer you get to spaces of higher education. And obviously that makes investment sense from the supplier side, but it makes it challenging for students. It also affects the supply and demand of various other services. As I've mentioned, the types of retail service offerings could also alter and change within an area that has undergone studentification. Socially, we see a complete demographic shift of a much younger population that's often transient. So you have a group moving in that are only there for 10 months of the year. So it's incredibly seasonal, and that also has an impact on the local economy, especially for retail and other service offerings. There's also conflicting lifestyles, often with students and long-term residents. Unfortunately, we do see instances of tension and conflict, especially linked to student lifestyle of partying and noise nuisance, etc., etc. And that's also a cultural impact. Physically, congestion, littering, upkeep of public spaces, all of these are issues that are often related with an increased student population in a particular area. So now shifting to South Africa and what has the trends been in studentification in South Africa. So in South Africa, post-apartheid higher education policy has increasingly focused on access. And access was to be achieved through massification and democratization of the higher education system. So the policy framework for higher education in South Africa since the late 90s has been incredibly favorable towards massification. And this is reflected in the number of student enrollments. Between 1993 to 1999, black student enrollment increased by 80%, and majority of black student enrollment has been at historically white higher education institutions. So we also see a massive transformation. We see the transformation of urban spaces and institutions that were historically, during apartheid, dedicated to a small white minority population, transforming very rapidly and very quickly. Student enrollment doubled from about 495,356 students in 1994 to close to 976,000 in 2016. And this is at public higher education institutions, plus an additional 167,408 students at private higher education institutions. The National Development Plan has set a target to increase the number of student enrollment to 1.6 million by 2030. So I think it is quite important to keep track of this trajectory of the massification that is occurring and to make sure that the rollout of affordable and safe accommodation is on par with this, these trends. Funding and financial aid has been central to massification, and this is echoing what Palesa has mentioned about NSFAS and other forms of funding. The establishment of the National Student Financial Aid Scheme has been instrumental in achieving this mandate of increased access for higher education. In 1991, 7,240 students had access to funding through Tertiary Education Fund of South Africa. And by 2002, under the newly reconstituted NSFAS, it increased to almost 100,000 students. By 2016, this number reached 481,507 students. And with a budget of 16.4 billion in 2018, 604,114 students received funding from this scheme. So these numbers reflect this incredible growth of students receiving funding from NSFAS. But despite this, the cost of tuition fees and the cost of accommodation and to fund studying in general is still prohibitive for many poor and working class students who face a financial shortfall. And I'll unpack this a little bit later. Obviously, we all know about the Fees Must Fall protests, which reached its peak during 2015 and 2016. And this really highlighted the challenge of affordability of tuition fees, but also of accommodation. Poor and working class students are often faced with a financial shortfall, particularly at more expensive institutions and cities. So we also have to take into consideration that different institutions and different cities will have different price ranges for tuition fees and rental rates. In the popular press and in the State of Nation address by the President, there was, into 2020, there was talk of students sleeping in libraries, students sleeping in labs, students not having a proper place to sleep. So in 2020, President Cyril Ramaphosa recognized the shortage of affordable student housing in his State of the Nation address, mentioning that some students don't even have places to sleep after lectures and resort to sleeping in libraries. And he also mentions that government will set aside funding as well as try and incorporate private sector investors to help solve this problem. So shifting to Johannesburg, and particularly what my research focused on. I can see this map is a bit overexposed on this presentation, but I will just quickly chat about the higher education landscape in Johannesburg. So as you can see, there are several institutions in Johannesburg, or several campuses rather. You've got the UJ Auckland Park campus, you've got the UJ Bunting Road campus, Wits Braamfontein, Wits Parktown, as well as UJ Doornfontein campus. So within a small radius stretching from Auckland Park to Doornfontein, there are several university campuses and 2 major universities. Apart from that, there are also several private higher education institutions, most notably in Braamfontein, but also around the Auckland Park, Mill Park area. So the city of Johannesburg is incredibly popular. It's a popular city amongst local, regional, and international students for accessing quality higher education. The University of the Witwatersrand has around 40,000 students. The University of Johannesburg is one of the largest contact institutions in the country, with around 50,000 students spread across 4 campuses. The bulk of those students are located at the Auckland Park Kingsway campus, with around 27,000 students. In 2018, UJ reported that 20,663 of its students received NSFAS of around 1.6 billion. Not only is NSFAS funding important for the payment of tuition fees, but it largely funds the privately owned student accommodation sector that has flourished around the city. A lot of the students, particularly the commune market, and a lot of the PBSA suppliers around the institution are the link with NSFAS is incredibly strong. UJ only offers around 6,643 beds on campus, so there's an enormous shortfall, and most of its students are channeled into private student accommodation. In 2018, 18,057 students were resident in privately owned student accommodation. It's important to note that this is 18,057 students in accredited suppliers. So there's also a large portion of these students that are also channeled into more illegal and precarious types of living conditions. The university has established a dedicated department to manage the quality control and accreditation process of private suppliers of student accommodation. So UJ's been at the forefront of this. They've got a dedicated department. They've got a specific policy in place for the accreditation of private suppliers of student accommodation. Their policy is often used for best practice, and a lot of other institutions have adopted UJ's policy and accreditation process. Apart from the institution, or from the university the city of Johannesburg has also recognized the impact of private student housing. In 2009, the city released its commune policy, which restricts the total number of communes to 20% in residential areas, and tries to regulate and monitor compliance of city bylaws. So this policy is more focused on managing or regulating the commune market, but there isn't really any policy recognition of PPSAs as yet. This policy response is largely to mitigate the negative impacts associated with communes, which in the early 2000s was largely unregulated, haphazard development. People or property owners were converting properties without going through formal processes. In 2013, the city also announced its ambitious Corridors of Freedom initiative, which is now called Transit-Oriented Development. It rolled out the Rea Vaya rapid bus transit system that links Soweto with the inner city of Johannesburg. And along the Empire-Perth route, you have UJ, Wits, and several private higher education institutions. So along this corridor, policy environment of the city of Johannesburg has also become increasingly favorable towards densification. And it is along this corridor, particularly in Auckland Park, that we see a lot of purpose-built student accommodation developments occurring. This portion of the corridor is also being designated as a knowledge precinct, which has stimulated investment interest. But the inner city of Johannesburg has also become an important space, particularly for retrofitted student accommodation. 3 different types of communes can be identified within the environs of the university. First is the accredited properties. So these properties go through the proper processes. They have university accreditation, but they also have a commune license from the city of Johannesburg to operate legally. So NSFAS will only pay if students reside in accredited properties that are both university accredited and accredited by the city of Johannesburg. Second, there are non-accredited communes. So these communes are not accredited by the university, but they do have a legal license to operate through the city of Johannesburg. So they meet the requirements of the city of Johannesburg, but they do not necessarily meet the requirements of the university. Third, and this is the most worrisome, is the group of illegal communes. They do not have consent use or a commune license to operate. And it is quite unfortunate that still a large number of students are channeled into these very precarious conditions, which is not that affordable, and the living conditions can be quite dire. An audit of accredited communes revealed that there are 140 university accredited communes in residential areas surrounding Auckland Park Kingsway campus, which supplies housing for around 1,258 students. It is however the proliferation of illegal communes that remains a challenge for the community and the city and for students. It is estimated that there are 905 illegal communes surrounding the University of Johannesburg, with a conservative estimate of 7,240 people living in such illegal communes. This is something that the university is struggling with. And suppliers are constantly invited to become accredited, but the stringent accreditation process is off-putting for many of these suppliers, and they still manage to fill their communes. The demand is so high that even without the accreditation, cash-paying students or self-funded students often still end up living in some of these illegal communes. So just to look at the spatial distribution of these communes, you will see that the majority of communes are actually clustered, and these are the accredited communes. I do not have data for the illegal communes. It's very difficult to get data on illegal communes. The majority of accredited communes are located in Brixton and in Hurst Hill, as well as Westdean. You will notice that Melville and Auckland Park, because of higher property prices or property values, communes are less prevalent there, or if they are located in Auckland Park and Melville, they're not necessarily accredited. So the majority of accredited communes are in Brixton and Hurst Hill and Westdean, but it's also important to note that there are lots of illegal communes in Brixton and in Hurst Hill. So key motivation for investors entering this market, both HMOs and PBSA, is the total rent generated per property offers a higher yield than from a single family, so therefore there's a closure of the rent gap. There's a guaranteed and projectable income. There's also the guaranteed rental income with the NSFAS link, which is very attractive for a lot of investors. Students are also perceived as low-risk tenants and form part of a transient group or a population group with less risk of staying on in properties and not paying rent. But this said, there are also various challenges linked to student housing, particularly HMOs. I think something we need to keep an eye out on is the sustainability of government or NSFAS funding. This market is so reliant on this link. University accreditation process is incredibly stringent. This puts a lot of operators or suppliers off the accreditation process, as well as the limitations set by the City of Johannesburg. High maintenance costs and rising cost of municipal services, the risk of self-funded students absconding for cheaper options. This is particularly at self-funded properties where students or at communes. Uninformed investors. Quite often homes are advertised as a potential commune, and someone buys it without understanding the rigorous process of going through university accreditation or going through city accreditation. And quite often you have a lot of buyer's remorse or investors shifting to illegal operations because they were uninformed. Illegal communes remains a major challenge. There's also community resistance to commune development. Negative media reporting tends to tarnish the industry, and the impact of crime is quite rife, particularly within the HMO sector. So now I'm going to shift to purpose-built, or PBSA, student accommodation in Johannesburg. There is evidence of a shift from HMOs to PBSA in South Africa. And this is something or trend that's increased over the past 10 years. Several national suppliers such as Campus Key, Uniloft, South Point, and Respublica have emerged as key players in the provision of purpose-built and retrofitted student accommodation. Student accommodation located in the inner city of Johannesburg have largely been retrofitted through the conversion of old office buildings, hotels, industrial, and some residential buildings into dormitory-style student accommodation or student residences. An audit revealed that there are 48 suppliers in Johannesburg offering student accommodation or bed space for 25,460 students in Johannesburg. So this data was compiled using the University of Johannesburg's list of accredited suppliers, as well as the University of the Witwatersrand list of accredited suppliers, as well as cross-referencing with a desktop audit, making sure I haven't missed any of the suppliers. The inner city of Johannesburg has emerged as an important space for this housing market. Collectively, 26 of those suppliers are located within the inner city and offer space to 21,678 students. Thus, 85% of students are channeled into student accommodation located in the inner city of Johannesburg. If we look at the spatial distribution, we can see that around Braamfontein, near Wits, and around Doornfontein, at the UJ Doornfontein campus, two clusters are emerging. Braamfontein has really emerged as a student district. Apart from housing, there's also various other student services, often linked to entertainment and the nighttime economy. And then we also see, not as clustered, but a lot of accommodation options surrounding Doornfontein, in Doornfontein, New Doornfontein, as well as Bertram's and parts of Hillbrow. Around Auckland Park, we are only now beginning to see PBSA emerging, purpose-built student accommodation, especially along Richmond Avenue in Auckland Park. It's not on the map here, but there's a brand new development just behind Campus Square. In Brixton, there's been a few which you could consider PBSA, as well as a few in Westdean. But for the most part, PBSA or rather retrofitted student accommodation is concentrated in the inner city. So now I'm going to shift to the students' lived experiences. And this will dovetail quite nicely with the next session, which I think is on student experiences. So perhaps this will link quite nicely with what the students have to say. So the 3 points that I've highlighted that students struggle with the most when it comes to student accommodation is affordability, safety and the impact of crime, as well as accessibility and proximity. So affordability, I've already touched on that, but I'll just reiterate that affordability of higher education has become a contentious issue in South Africa. There are various challenges for self-funded students in particular, which puts a lot of pressure on families to fund tuition fees and accompanying living costs. UJ calls this the missing middle. Even with NSFAS and other bursaries, students often face a financial shortfall. Some students have resorted to sleeping in libraries or live in precarious conditions which are not safe and conducive for learning. This is a quote from a focus group I conducted with a group of its students. And I quote, "I mean, the 4,500 Rand per month that the accommodation charges means you must be paying around 45,000 Rand per year. And then if you must pay another 60,000 in tuition fees, bursaries don't really give over 100,000 per year, especially in undergrad. So you will have to top up somehow, somewhere. And that basically is just you sleeping and going to class. It does not include what you wear, eat, drink, and your devices." Shifting to safety. Safety is a major concern for students living particularly in the inner city of Johannesburg, and also the residential areas surrounding UJ, most notably Brixton and Hurst Hill. Many students walk, especially if their accommodation is located within a 3-kilometer radius from the institution. Shuttle services are not offered, and therefore they have to rely on walking, which makes them susceptible to muggings and robberies. The safety experience varies at HMOs and PBSAs. I think that's important to highlight. Student communes are access control, and the safety measures at housing and multiple occupational student communes are not as stringent as the security measures at PBSAs. So a lot of the intense experiences of home invasions and robberies, that tends to happen in your PBSA, your student communes or HMOs. PBSAs, students tend to feel much safer within the building once they've entered the building, but it's the space surrounding the building often that students are concerned about. So there's also the safety experience inside the building versus the safety experience in the surrounding neighborhood. And we tend to focus on student accommodation. Student accommodation, we need so many beds. Okay, it's within 2-kilometer radius of an institution. But there's often very little consideration taken into the neighborhood conditions. How safe or secure or how livable are the neighborhoods in which these accommodation suppliers are located? Certain parts of the city or certain residential areas are considered safer than others. Others are obviously a lot more dangerous. Many students also indicated the cost versus benefit for safety. So students do recognize that safety is a major consideration when they choose accommodation. And they are actually willing to pay more for safety if they can afford it. So these are just a collection of very unfortunate headlines from a local newspaper in Johannesburg, the Melville Northcliffe Chronicle, or Melville Northcliffe Times. So you can see concern grows for increasing student-targeted crime, student robbed at gunpoint in Westdean, UJ student killed in Brixton. He had only been in Johannesburg for 7 days. We hear this every year, especially when first-year students arrive. They're new to Johannesburg. They do not understand the reputation of certain neighborhoods, or they don't understand that certain parts of certain areas you cannot walk alone. So this is something we see every year. So I'm just going to pull out a few quotes, and I think it's best to look at these quotes because these are the students' voices. "The biggest issue with walking around is the safety concern. Criminals target students, and they know we carry devices, and they know it's easy picking for them. You don't have any means of protection. Even if you walk in groups, the criminals will also come in groups and rob you. Inside the building we are safe, but outside it is very dangerous. When we walk to Doornfontein campus, we face danger." And I like this last quote. "It's the in-between spaces between your building to transport and to campus that are dangerous." Lastly, proximity, or access. Students are also quite motivated to stay as close as possible to the institution. or to a campus. So proximity is key. Inner city accommodation, however, is a challenge for students, particularly at Auckland Park Kingsway. It is not that close and students have to rely on a shuttle service. This means there is some commuting that has to take place, and especially during peak hours, this can take some time. Here we've got a student complaining about having to wake up quite early for an 8 a.m. class and then having to sit in peak hour traffic to get to campus on time. So I'm going to end off by posing quite a few important questions, and these are questions hopefully we will be able to answer throughout the duration of this conference or the summit. I think very importantly, the sustainability of the NSFAS funding. The sustainability of NSFAS is something to keep an eye on. The market, particularly around UJ, is incredibly reliant on the NSFAS link. The unregulated student accommodation sector or suppliers is a major challenge for universities, accredited suppliers, as well as students. There's need for a collective effort to try and regulate the illegal component of this sector. This will result in more stringent accreditation and monitoring. The growth of private student accommodation also poses several challenges for urban management. These include challenges in bylaw enforcement. The affordability of student accommodation and the impact of crime on student safety remains a central concern for students. There's a need to understand the diversity of challenges and experiences at student accommodation across South Africa, both in more rural environments as well as more urban environments. The experience of students at different types of institutions in different locales obviously will differ, and there's a need to understand these differences. And I think very importantly, there is a need for partnerships between the city, higher education institutions, suppliers of accommodation, communities and students to effectively manage and mitigate the challenges associated with private student accommodation. For the most part, these discussions are all often happening within silos. One of the biggest complaints communities have in Johannesburg is that the university does not consult them. The university is not actively consulting with community regarding these challenges, the challenges of student accommodation. So there's definitely a need for greater partnerships between the different stakeholders involved in this process of studentification. And I think that's where I'm going to end off. I think I've stuck within time, but there's about 5 minutes left if there are any questions or comments. I thank you for your time.
Hi, my name is Balisa. So the question I have is around Braamfontein. We get approached a lot by developers still looking to put up buildings in that area. Do you think that it's overtraded as yet?
There's a bit of a monopoly in Braamfontein, definitely. South Point is one of the biggest players there. So I think it's incredibly difficult perhaps to compete at the level that South Point is pitching its offering, which is a very much focused on student lifestyle. But there's definitely perhaps a need for more affordable options within Braamfontein. So if developers were to focus really on a much more affordable offering, more affordable than perhaps some of the more luxury lifestyle options that are already available in Braamfontein, there could be scope for that. Braamfontein is an incredibly exciting node for students, and a lot of students do want to reside there. So I would assume the demand for the area is fairly high still. I don't know if that answers your question. Okay.
Then the last question is, again, we'll see somebody come with a development that they say is going to cater for Wits as well as the UJ Durbanfontein campus. Is it possible to have a structure that is adequately positioned to cater for that entire area, including the private colleges, and still tick the boxes around proximity and security and safety?
Is it linked to transport? Am I getting the question right? Or what's, sorry if you can just...
No, it's not linked to transport. It's a project, for example, that says that they're going to cater to Wit students.
To various universities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if you speak about proximity and safety, is that actually possible?
As soon as it's 3 kilometers away from a campus, they have to offer a shuttle service. So if they're located in Braamfontein, for example, obviously the Witslink is perfectly fine because students are able to walk to campus. But then definitely for Doornfontein campus perhaps, and Bunting Road or Auckland Park, you will need to provide a shuttle service for those students. It's just too far, simply too far to walk. I think part of the norms and standards from the DHET on student accommodation, it is stipulated that as soon as an accommodation supplier is 3 kilometers from a particular institution it is serving, they have to offer a shuttle service. So that it becomes a bit more difficult if it's trying to put to more than one campus. Which one is your most prominent campus? Which one do you serve the most? So in Braamfontein, the focus tends to be a lot more on WITS students. Even though there are a lot of UJ students living there, bizarrely enough, a lot of UJ students actually live in the inner city, and then obviously have to rely on shuttle services into Auckland Park.
Okay, thank you very much, JJ, for that. We're gonna take a 5 minutes break. While we are doing this, we even have more questions for JJ.